Hey there. Tonight, we are beginning in front of a mirror. And that is already stranger than it sounds. Because if the glass were able to thin out, if the silver backing could open like cold water, and if someone from 70,000 years ago stepped through to stand beside you, you would not be looking at a beast from another world. You would be looking at a person. A person with your kind of hands, your kind of eyes, your kind of face. Maybe the clothes would need work, but the body would feel almost shockingly familiar. And that is the unsettling thing. Our cities changed. Our languages changed. Our tools changed. Our entire world changed. But our bodies somehow almost stopped. If you enjoy these slow mysteries, please like the video and subscribe. Then dim the room a little. Let your jaw unclench. Let your breathing settle. Let the day step back from the edge of your thoughts. Because tonight, we are following one of the strangest stories in human history. The story of how a species survived catastrophe and then seemed to freeze in place. Look at your hands for a moment. I mean that gently. Not in a dramatic way. Just notice them. The tendons, the knuckles, the tiny, pale half-moons at the base of the nails, the lines crossing the palm like dry riverbeds on a map. These are modern hands in the ordinary sense. They can type, grip a steering wheel, hold a glass, scroll a phone, steer, soup, button a shirt, do all the mundane little acts that make up a life. But they are also ancient hands. Very ancient. Hands that would not have looked especially out of place in Eastern Africa 200,000 years ago, when anatomically modern humans first appear in the record. I have always found it strange that people are willing to believe deep time when it comes to rocks, mountains, stars, fossils, anything really. But the moment the subject is our own face, our own body, our own skull, we instinctively imagine dramatic difference. We expect a primitive stranger. We expect something rougher, almost theatrical. Yet when paleoanthropologists reconstruct these early humans, the shock is how little the main structure has changed. The skull becomes more modern over that long approach. Yes, earlier forms differ more clearly. But by the time we reach the human standing near the threshold of 200,000 years ago, then 140,000 years ago, then 70,000 years ago, the essential silhouette is already with us. That is the hook, really. Not just that we are ancient. That we are ancient without looking as changed as we should. If evolution were behaving the way most people imagine it, the story should feel different. The last 70,000 years should have rewritten us physically. We crossed deserts, coasts, forests, highlands, river valleys, and ice-edged landscapes. We entered climates our ancestors had never seen. We encountered predators, scarcity, competition, new diseases, new foods, and long stretches of uncertainty sharp enough to cut whole populations down. That kind of pressure should leave strong marks on bone and body. Yet most of the time it does not. Not in the big visible way. Not in the way it once did during earlier human evolution. So the first mystery is simple enough to say, even if it is not simple to answer. Why do you look so much like someone who lived 70,000 years ago? The source transcript answers this with a sentence that sounds almost impossible the first time you hear it. Human evolution, in the major physical sense, slowed to an extraordinary crawl around 70,000 years ago. Not because genes stopped mutating. They did not. Not because change vanished entirely. It did not. But because something else began to outrun biology. Something faster. Something far more flexible. Something that would make fur, claw, fang, and skeletal redesign look almost slow and clumsy by comparison. Culture. That word can sound too soft for what it really means. People hear culture and think of music, paintings, holidays, recipes, polite things. But in this story, culture means the learned survival machinery of a thinking species. Fire kept alive from one generation to the next. Tool shapes remembered. Hunting methods taught. Shelter designs improved. Knowledge stored in minds and passed between them before death could erase it. A trick for cutting hide. A better way to track hoof marks in mud. A warning about what not to eat when the season turns mean. A way of surviving winter without waiting 20,000 years for thicker fur. But before culture takes over, before human learning begins to beat genes in a straight race, the story takes us to the edge of extinction. That is where the air changes. About 74,000 years ago, in what is now Sumatra, a mountain did what mountains very occasionally do when the earth decides to remind everyone who is in charge. It came apart with a violence so large it is difficult to think about without accidentally making it cartoonish. Mount Toba was not an ordinary eruption. It was a super eruption, one of the largest in the last 2 million years, and the scale of it is hard to carry in the mind. Vast volumes of ash, stone, and pulverized earth lifted into the atmosphere. Sulfur driven upward. The sky changed. Light changed. Temperatures changed. The season itself seemed to tear. Try to imagine being alive during the first strange days after such an event. Not as a scientist with graphs and satellite models, but as a human in a small mobile band whose world depends on patterns staying recognizable. You know where the water usually runs. You know which plants fruit after heat, which animal paths become busy after rain, which ground is safe, which ground swallows your ankles, which trees hold edible things and which only hold disappointment. That kind of knowledge is not decorative. It is life itself. It is a living map carried inside the body. Then the map fails. The sky stays dimmer than it should. Ash falls in thin gray sheets, or thicker blankets in some places, clinging to skin and leaves and water edges. The smell is dry and bitter, like heated stone and old dust forced into the lungs. Light takes on a weak and colorless quality. The sun is there, but not really there, as if the day has been placed behind a dirty skin of glass. Plants begin to fail. Waterholes become contaminated. Grazing animals move unpredictably, sicken, or die. The familiar calendar of survival begins slipping out of human hands. A volcanic winter. That is the phrase scientists use. It sounds clinical, almost neat, but it means prolonged cold, reduced sunlight, Broken ecological timing, food webs unraveling from the bottom upward. And for a creature living hand to mouth, season to season, that kind of collapse is not an inconvenience. It is the end of the world with poor manners. The source transcript lingers over the numbers because the numbers deserve to be lingered over. Temperatures may have dropped dramatically in some regions. Ash spread across astonishing distances. The harshest atmospheric effects may have lasted years, perhaps longer in environmental aftershocks. There is still debate at the edges. Of course, some scholars argue the catastrophe was regionally uneven. Some climate records appear more complex than a single clean disaster line. The exact scale is debated. The result is not. Something terrible happened in this window, and humanity narrowed. That narrowing remains inside us. Modern genetic evidence, especially when researchers examine mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome patterns, and wider genomic diversity, suggests that our species passed through a severe bottleneck. A bottleneck is one of those scientific terms that sounds plain until you let it settle. It means the wide river became a trickle. It means the vast field became a doorway. It means that out of all the humans alive before the crisis, only a comparatively tiny number passed through to become ancestors of everyone living now. Some estimates place the number of breeding humans at around 10,000. Some go lower, much lower. Even if one chooses the more cautious range, the picture remains cold. Humanity was not reduced to a proud little remnant marching into a heroic future. Humanity was reduced to frightened bands in refuge zones, clinging to survivable corners of a wounded planet. And here, if you were standing beside me at the fire, I would probably pause for a second and say that this is where the story becomes uncomfortably intimate. Because all 8 billion of us, every city, every village, every nation, every argument on the internet, every wedding, every quiet breakfast, every child asleep in a crib, every violin lesson, every crowded train platform, every person reading under a lamp at midnight, all of us came through that narrow living doorway. Our bodies carry the shape of survivors. Not survivors in a poetic sense only. Actual survivors. The ones who happen to be in the right refuges, with the right flexibility, the right cooperation, the right luck, the right capacity to keep going when the world stopped making sense. This is where the usual expectation would be that evolution speeds up. A population crash this severe should, in theory, create fierce selection, small surviving groups, terrible environmental pressure, limited resources. All the ruthless machinery of natural selection should be grinding away with special enthusiasm. Whatever body type works best under the new conditions should spread. Whatever does not should disappear. That is how the story normally goes in other species. But humans did something odd. Very odd. Instead of changing mainly through body structure, we began relying more and more on learned behavior. Better use of fire. Better control of space. Better cooperation. Better teaching. Better memory. Better symbols. Better tools. Better social organization. In other words, once the bottleneck finished reducing us, the species that came through it began surviving less by becoming physically different, and more by becoming mentally connected. That does not mean our ancestors suddenly put on spectacles and started discussing philosophy by a riverbank. I do not want to flatter prehistory into nonsense. It means something much more practical. A useful idea could spread faster than a useful mutation. That is the whole secret, and it changed everything. If cold weather arrives, a wolf population must wait for selection to favor bodies suited to that cold. If humans can stitch hide, bank a fire, and keep children close to shelter, then the environment does not get the same chance to sculpt the body. If prey changes behavior, another predator may need generations of physical advantage. Humans can teach one another a new hunting method in a season. If a plant becomes edible only after grinding and heating, genes are not the first answer. Hands are. Memory is. Repetition is. Instruction is. Culture began outrunning biology. Not all at once. Not as a magical switch. More like the first moment in a race when one runner, almost without anyone noticing, edges ahead and never truly falls back. So part of what Toba did, if we follow the source's main argument faithfully, was not merely threaten extinction. It forced humanity into a narrower, more cognitively demanding future. The survivors passed through with reduced genetic diversity and a body plan already close to ours. Then the pressure of the new world rewarded what their minds could share faster than what their genes could slowly redesign. And that is why the mirror at the beginning matters. Because when you look into it, you are not only seeing a modern person, you are seeing the outline that made it through the bottleneck. The chassis, if you like that comparison, though it sounds less romantic than it is. The same basic frame, the same kind of skull, the same kind of hand, the same species form that survived long enough for culture to take the steering wheel. In the next movement, we go deeper into the bottleneck itself, into the DNA, into the low diversity of our species, because the volcanic ash eventually settled, and the narrowing never fully disappeared. It is still here, written quietly in every cell you have. When the ash finally begins to settle in the imagination, the story becomes even stranger, because the real scar is not only in the sky, it is in the body, in the blood, in the code folded inside every living human cell. The source transcript moves there with good reason. Catastrophes are dramatic, but bottlenecks are intimate. An eruption can darken a planet, yet a bottleneck is what remains after the sky clears. It is the permanent narrowing of possibility. It is the moment when a species loses most of its variation and never fully gets it back. That is what makes the Toba story feel less like old disaster and more like inherited memory. Let us take it slowly. Every person carries several kinds of genetic history at once. There is the wide mixed inheritance from both parents, the grand woven quilt of nuclear DNA. There is mitochondrial DNA, passed down the maternal line, quieter and more direct, almost like an old whisper from mother to child, then to child again. Over long ages, there is the Y chromosome line for paternal descent in males, a narrower corridor of inheritance moving through fathers and sons. Scientists read these patterns the way other people read rings in old trees or sediment lines in lake beds. The code keeps account, not with numbers written politely in ink, but with mutations accumulating, branching, narrowing, persisting. And when researchers began looking at humanity this way, something almost unsettling emerged. We are remarkably uniform for such a large, widespread species. Yet the genetic diversity across our species is unexpectedly low. Lower than one might guess. Lower than intuition likes. Lower, in some comparisons, than certain much smaller populations of other animals. The source makes this point with a kind of quiet disbelief. Chimpanzees, far fewer in number than humans, show more overall variation than we do. That is not the signature of a species with a broad, uninterrupted demographic past. That is the signature of a narrowing. I have always found that fact almost eerie in the best way. We appear so different to one another at the surface. Skin tones, hair forms, facial details, body size within normal ranges, regional features shaped by climate and ancestry. And yet beneath that visible variety, the shared architecture is astonishingly tight. We are not, genetically speaking, a sprawling old species with huge divergence. We are a close family that came through fire and cold and loss together. If you compare mitochondrial sequences across living populations, you can estimate how large the ancestral population may have been, and when major branches split away from one another. When this kind of work was done on humanity, the results kept bending back toward the same uncomfortable window. Around 70,000 to 80,000 years ago, give or take, our lineage looks pinched, narrow, reduced. The Y chromosome evidence, traveling through paternal lines, points in a strikingly similar direction. Different material, different inheritance path. Same basic story. Something happened to humanity in deep prehistory that reduced the number of lineages contributing strongly to later populations. Then broader nuclear DNA evidence, the mixed inheritance from both parents, helps fill out the same silhouette. The methods differ. The signature remains. Humanity contracted hard. Some readers want an exact number, as if the whole horror can be made more manageable if we place it neatly on a shelf. Was it 10,000? 5,000? 2,000? The source mentions ranges, and scholars still debate severity and timing at the margins. But the exact arithmetic is less important than the emotional truth. The species went frighteningly small. Small enough that later growth never restored what had been lost before. That is what a bottleneck means. And it is worth lingering over, because it is easy to misunderstand. Suppose a large population carries an enormous deck of genetic cards, many rare, many common, all shuffled across regions and generations. Then catastrophe cuts through the population so hard that only a small sample survives. Whatever rare variants were not represented in those survivors are simply gone. Not sleeping. Gone. Whatever possibilities lived in the lineages that vanished are gone with them. The future can grow wide again in numbers, but it cannot magically regrow the missing cards. Billions of descendants may emerge from a few thousand survivors, but they are still shuffling the same reduced deck. The source uses this idea to explain why our species appears almost frozen in certain basic physical ways. When the bottleneck crushed diversity, It also locked in a particular human form, or at least locked in the range from which later humanity would overwhelmingly be drawn. Body plan, skeletal proportion, approach after 18. The broad template of modern humans was already there in the survivors. And because so few lineages carried forward, that template hardened into the species standard. You can picture it almost like clay pressed into a mold under terrible pressure. Before the narrowing, there may have been more physical variation in the wider population. Taller and shorter groups, more robust and more gracile structures, subtle differences in cranial form and bone density. Then the crisis comes, and almost all those branches vanish. What remains is not a fair representative sample of everything humanity had been. It is simply who lived. That is such a sobering phrase. Who lived, not who deserved to. Not who was best in some clean, heroic sense. Who lived? The ones in survivable refuges. The ones with enough cooperation to avoid social collapse. The ones whose problem solving was fast enough. The ones who could shift diets, move when they had to move, trust one another enough to share a fire, a carcass, a warning, a remembered path. The source is careful here, and I think it is wise to be. Toba may have been the primary trigger, or Toba may have been the final shove in a period of broader climatic stress. Not every record lines up in perfect theatrical neatness. Some scholars question whether the eruption alone can explain the whole bottleneck. Some archaeological sites suggest continuity. Some climate reconstructions are more regionally messy than popular retellings like to admit. That uncertainty is real. But the source keeps returning to the central point, and the central point is sturdy. Whatever the exact combination of causes, humanity passed through a severe narrowing in this period, and the low variation is still with us. And there is another layer to this that makes the story softer and darker at the same time. The bottleneck did not only reduce variation, it also likely selected for a particular kind of survivor. Not necessarily the strongest in a simple muscular sense. Not even necessarily the healthiest in the narrowest body-based way. The source leans toward cognitive and social traits here, and that feels right. Intelligence mattered. Adaptability mattered. Cooperation mattered. Mental flexibility mattered. If preferred foods vanished, the band that could try something new had a chance. If familiar territory failed, the band that could move without falling apart had a chance. If old hunting routes became useless, the band that could invent, teach, and remember had a chance. These are not glamorous traits in storybook terms. They are quieter. Pattern recognition, planning, memory, social trust, a little creativity under pressure, the willingness to accept a better method from someone else instead of stubbornly clinging to yesterday's habit. If you were sitting by a dying fire 74,000 years ago, with cold air on your face and ash still changing the smell of the ground, you would not care whether your descendants would someday invent calculus or opera or central heating. You would care whether the group knew how to keep children alive until dawn, whether someone could remember the path to cleaner water, whether anybody had the sense to save embers under ash so the morning would not begin in darkness, whether the woman with the best memory of route locations could still walk, whether the person best at reading weather could still think clearly enough to lead. Those are cognitive and social traits, and the source argues that they became the true inheritance of the bottleneck. This is where the story begins, turning away from anatomy and toward mind. Not because bones stop mattering. They matter very much. But because once the bottleneck locks in the basic human chassis, the decisive changes ahead may no longer be primarily skeletal. A species with reduced genetic diversity and a relatively stable body form comes out of catastrophe carrying a different kind of advantage. It can teach. It can imitate efficiently. It can improve a solution and hand it on before death erases the lesson. The source calls this, in effect, the pivot. Before this, humans were evolving more like every other large mammal, through gradual selection, acting strongly on body and behavior across long spans. After this, culture begins taking more and more of the adaptive burden. Not all at once. The old machinery of evolution does not vanish, but it starts losing races it once won easily. Consider how strange that is. For millions of years, life on Earth has survived by waiting on genes. A helpful mutation appears. It spreads slowly, if conditions favor it. A better body shape emerges over long ages. Fur thickens. Limbs change proportion. Teeth adjust. Metabolism shifts. That is the old law. Then humanity begins breaking it. Softly at first. Not by escaping biology entirely, but by discovering that learned behavior can outrun mutation. The bottleneck matters because it narrowed the species enough that this new strategy became the real future. Reduced diversity. Stable basic form. Strong selection on cognition and cooperation. Out of that comes a human lineage primed not for endless anatomical reinvention, but for cumulative learning. And once cumulative learning takes hold, the body stops needing to do all the work. That sentence may be the cold little key to the whole story. If the world gets colder, genes may eventually help, but clothing can help tomorrow. If prey changes behavior, genes may eventually help, but better tools can help tomorrow. If a refuge dries out, genes may eventually help, but migration and shared knowledge can help tomorrow. Tomorrow is faster than evolution. That is the human advantage. It is also the reason the mirror remains so uncanny. Because the person in the mirror is still built on the bottleneck template. Still built from that reduced deck. Still carrying the general structure that survived when humanity nearly slipped into extinction. Your body is older than civilization in any meaningful sense. Older than cities. Older than kings. Older than agriculture. Older than writing. The great sweep of later history sits on top of a biological frame that was already largely present before any of those things began. And I think that is why this topic unsettles people so much once they really feel it. It tells us that progress, in the bodily sense, is not what we imagine. We built rockets with a Pleistocene skeleton, and we text each other with hands shaped in a world of ash, hunger, and long survival. The source is building toward the cognitive revolution from here, and you can feel it leaning in that direction. Because once low genetic diversity and bottleneck inheritance are in place, the next great question is what humans did with that inherited form. How they turned stable anatomy into exploding capability. How symbolic thought, art, language, and cumulative teaching suddenly began spreading with the speed that genes could never match. So for now, let the DNA sit quietly in the background, like a low hum under the fire. A maternal line stretching back into darkness. A paternal line narrowing and branching. A genome carrying the scar of contraction. A species that should have transformed physically under such pressure, yet somehow did not, at least not in the dramatic way. A species that instead emerged with the same basic body and a strange new future. In the next movement, the mind begins to light up. Not with magic, with something better and more dangerous. Shared knowledge. Symbolic thought. The first signs that humans were about to stop adapting mainly through flesh and begin adapting through memory, teaching, invention, and culture. Once the bottleneck is inside the story, the world begins to feel smaller. That is the emotional truth of genetics when you sit beside it long enough. It shrinks the stage. A moment ago, we were looking at ash in the sky, cold sunlight, hunted landscapes, and scattered human groups crossing damaged ground. Now we move inward, into cells, into inheritance, into the quiet code that does not care whether a person lived in a cave mouth, under a hide shelter, beside a marsh, or on the edge of an ancient woodland. DNA is patient in a way history is not. History burns. DNA waits. The source leans into that patience. It wants the listener to understand that catastrophe can vanish from the land and still remain in the body. Ash can wash away. Forests can return. Rivers can find their banks again. But if most of a species disappears during the crisis, the future is forced through the narrow opening left behind. That narrowing becomes permanent. So let us slow down and make the bottleneck feel real. Imagine an enormous woven cloth stretched wide between generations. Thousands of threads, colors, or tangents, textures. Some threads bright and common. Some rare and nearly hidden. Some stronger. Some delicate. Some carrying features that may never become visible unless the world one day calls for them. A healthy large population holds many such threads at once. Then catastrophe comes with shears. Most of the cloth is cut away. What survives is not the whole pattern. It is a remnant, enough to weave from again, but no longer enough to recreate everything that was lost. That is what the source wants us to feel when it talks about human genetic diversity. Modern humans are many things, but genetically extravagant is not one of them. Our surface variation is loud enough to fool us. We notice faces first, skin first, hair first, body shape first, because human attention is tuned to visible difference. But beneath that level, across the actual inherited code, we are surprisingly close to one another. Very close, considering how many of us there are and how many environments we occupy. This is one of those findings that never loses its ability to feel eerie. 7 continents worth of people, and yet not nearly as much deep divergence as intuition expects. The source brings in mitochondrial DNA first because it offers such a clean maternal thread. Mitochondria are passed from mother to child in a line that bypasses the usual mixing of most genetic inheritance. That makes them useful for tracing deep ancestry. Not magical, not perfect, but useful in the calm forensic sense. When researchers map these maternal lineages backward, the branches narrow. They do not stay broad forever. They bend toward a smaller ancestral population. Then the Y chromosome enters, narrower still, moving through paternal lines in males. Different pathway, different inheritance logic. Yet it bends in a similar direction. That is part of what gives the bottleneck story its force. The maternal whisper and the paternal corridor both lean toward the same old narrowing. And beyond those, the wider genomic data, the broader mixed inheritance from both parents across all the chromosomes, tells a related story. Human beings simply do not carry the level of deep variation that a long, uninterrupted, massive population would be expected to preserve. Something pruned us hard. I have always found it almost haunting that science can tell such a dark story so softly. No scream, no heroic soundtrack, just statistical patterns, mutation rates, lineage trees, frequencies, diversity measures. The language is calm, while the implication is brutal. Most of the people who once carried the future of our species did not pass it on. If you were standing here with me beside the fire, I would probably pause there again, because that line deserves a little quiet around it. Most of the people who once carried the future of our species did not pass it on. Their lines ended. Their versions of humanity, whatever subtle combinations they held, vanished into the dark with them. Some of what vanished would have been invisible to us anyway. Little genetic possibilities that never had time to matter. Some might have mattered a great deal in another world that never arrived. The bottleneck is cruel in that way. It does not select according to human drama. It does not choose the noble line or the poetic line. It chooses whoever remains by chance, by geography, by cooperation, by timing, by adaptability, by 1,000 tiny, brutal accidents. The source is careful not to overclaim, and that restraint is part of why the argument works. It does not say every scientist agrees that Toba alone caused the bottleneck in the cleanest possible way. It does not flatten decades of complex paleoanthropological debate into one tidy volcanic sermon. Some researchers place more emphasis on longer climatic instability. Some question the scale of Toba's demographic effect in every region. Some argue the bottleneck may have multiple layered causes. All of that is fair. The uncertainty at the edges is real. But uncertainty at the edges is not uncertainty at the center. At the center sits a hard fact. Humanity passed through a severe narrowing. Whether Toba was the main blade or one blade among several, the species came out reduced. And that reduced condition is still written into us. This is where the source makes one of its most interesting moves. It argues that the bottleneck did not just reduce numbers. It reduced available futures. A smaller breeding population means a smaller deck of inherited possibilities. You can imagine the deck before catastrophe as thick, unruly, crowded with options. After catastrophe, far fewer cards remain in play. The species can still thrive, multiply, expand across the planet. But all of that later abundance is built from a much narrower starting set. That is why the source links the bottleneck not only to low diversity, but to anatomical stability. If the basic modern human body plan was already well established among the survivors, then later, humanity would inherit that plan with remarkable consistency. Not because evolution stopped in the literal sense. Genes still mutate. Selection still acts. Local traits still shift. But the core design had survived the funnel. That means the range of dramatic structural change ahead may have been greatly reduced. The species emerged from the crisis with a body type that worked well enough, and with too little deep variation remaining for radical new body plans to rise easily on a large scale. There is something almost sobering in that. We tend to imagine the future as open. The bottleneck reminds us that biological futures can be closed long before anyone knows they existed. Picture those surviving populations scattered across refuge zones. Coastlines, perhaps. Better watered corridors. Pockets of ecological resilience. Small bands connected by kinship, exchange, memory, maybe fear. Their numbers are low enough that every birth matters differently. Every death matters differently. The genetic future of the species is no longer a broad river. It is a handful of cups being passed carefully from one fire to another. And now another layer enters. Who survives a bottleneck is never only a matter of body shape. The source leans toward cognitive and social selection here, and it is difficult not to follow that logic. A physically strong individual in a collapsing world may still fail if they cannot adapt behaviorally. A clever individual may still fail if the group cannot cooperate around them. Survival in such conditions depends on networks of traits. Memory, learning speed, social trust, flexibility, emotional control under pressure, curiosity that is disciplined enough to become problem-solving rather than foolish risk, the willingness to imitate a better technique instead of clinging to pride. These are very human advantages, and they leave subtler marks than larger teeth or thicker fur. Honestly, that may be why the bottleneck feels so important to this entire thesis. It suggests that the surviving template of humanity was not merely a body that endured, but a mind that shared, copied, and adapted. Once that kind of species comes through the funnel, later, evolution begins to behave differently. Selection can still work, yes, but the creature under selection is now buffering itself with intelligence and culture at increasing speed. The source has not fully arrived at the cognitive revolution yet, but you can feel it approaching. The bottleneck becomes the tightening of the string before the note sounds. Low diversity. Stable body plan. Survivors selected not only by physical endurance, but by social and cognitive usefulness. A species emerging from near extinction, already oddly close to its final outward shape, but inwardly primed for something explosive. You know that feeling when a machine seems quiet from outside, then you realize all the pressure is building inside it. That is how this part of the story feels. Outwardly, humanity looks frozen. Inwardly, the preconditions for a completely different kind of survival are gathering. And before we leave the genetics, it is worth staying with one more emotional detail the source handles well. Shared ancestry at this scale is not sentimental. It is almost uncomfortable. It means that every living person on Earth belongs to a species family that passed through terrifying smallness. The modern world loves categories, tribes, borders, flags, chosen identities, historical quarrels, noble narratives of separation. Genetics arrives like an unwelcome guest and says, yes, all that happened later. But before all of it, your kind went nearly still in the throat of extinction and came through together. That does not solve politics. Of course, it does not make people gentle. But it does change the atmosphere of the mirror. The face looking back is not just yours. It is a survivor face, a bottleneck face, a line preserved because a very small number of human bodies kept giving the future another chance. The source also invites us to see how unusual this makes human history. Most species pass through changing environments under the slow rule of bodily selection. A trait is useful. It spreads if conditions allow. Another trait becomes harmful. It fades if conditions punish it. The body is the main battlefield. Humanity, after the bottleneck, begins shifting that battlefield elsewhere, into memory, into imitation, into transmission. And transmission is the real hinge. Because genes travel across generations, one birth at a time. But a useful idea can travel across a group in a single evening. A new way to hold a spear point. A better way to preserve embers. A warning about poisonous roots in a changed season. A trick for weaving a shelter against harsher wind. Once knowledge begins moving at that speed, natural selection is no longer the only clock shaping human survival. Another clock appears, faster, collective, cumulative. This is the point where the source's title question starts answering itself in a new register. Why did human evolution freeze after Toba nearly wiped us out? Because the bottleneck locked in a body plan and reduced the range of available biological futures, while simultaneously favoring the kinds of minds and groups that could solve problems without waiting for their bodies to change first. That is not the whole answer. But it is the essential architecture of the answer. So let the DNA rest now beneath the story like a dark underground river. Maternal lines, paternal lines, narrowed variation, lost branches, preserved inheritance, a species that emerged from ash and cold, carrying fewer genetic cards than before, yet carrying them in bodies already close to ours. In the next movement, those bodies begin doing something no species had ever done at this scale. They begin adapting with thought, with symbols, with shared knowledge, with culture that grows faster than bone ever could. And once that happens, the body no longer needs to change very much for the species to conquer nearly everything in front of it. But once the bottleneck has narrowed the species and fixed the basic human frame more firmly in place, the source turns toward the real revolution. Not a revolution of bone, not a revolution of muscle, not bigger teeth, stronger jaws, thicker limbs, or a dramatic new skull. Something quieter and, in the end, far more dangerous. A revolution of mind. This is the part where the story can easily become too triumphant if one is not careful. The source avoids that, and I think it is wise. It does not say that humanity suddenly became magical. It does not say that one morning people simply woke up poetic, civilized, and clever beyond recognition. It says something more interesting. At some point, after the bottleneck, traits like symbolic thought, language complexity, teaching, planning, and cumulative learning began accelerating so strongly that culture started changing human life much faster than biology could. That is an enormous claim, but it has a very intimate feel when you slow it down. Imagine a child sitting near a low fire after dark. The air is cooler now. The day hunt is over, or failed, or only partly successful. Hide clothing smells faintly of smoke and animal fat. Someone older is working a tool in the firelight, not quickly, because quick hands are not always teaching hands. The child watches. A stone is struck at a precise angle. A flake comes away cleanly. The elder pauses, adjusts grip, repeats the movement. A sound is made, maybe a word, maybe a click, maybe a whole sentence in a language already far richer than silence. The child tries, fails, tries again. The technique passes from one mind to another. That moment is tiny. It is also the future of the species. I have always thought that cumulative teaching is one of the most beautiful and unsettling ideas in human evolution. A wolf pup can learn much from adult wolves. Yes. A bird can learn songs. Many animals can imitate. But humans do something more layered. We preserve a technique, improve it, explain it, hand it down, then let the next generation begin not at zero, but at our best known point. That means knowledge stacks. It does not merely repeat. The source places this within what many call the cognitive revolution, or great leap forward. After roughly 70,000 years ago, though dates can vary across regions and debates continue over pace and exact timing, the archaeological record begins showing a different kind of humanity. More symbolic behavior. Beads. Engravings. Pigments like ochre used with likely meaning beyond pure practicality. More refined tools, long-distance movement of materials, evidence that minds are no longer just solving immediate problems, but storing significance, identity, and abstraction. This is where the sleep story can become very vivid if you let it. A cave wall in wavering firelight, a fingertip marked with red ochre, a shell bead turns slowly in the hand before a hole is pierced through it. A piece of stone chosen not only because it can cut, but because it can become a particular kind of point. A voice telling what happened last season, then another voice correcting it gently. And both acts mattering because memory is becoming collective rather than merely personal. The source is careful not to say that these things begin from nothing. Earlier humans were never mindless creatures waiting for a light bulb. That kind of story is too crude. What changes is the speed and the density of transmission. Symbolic thought becomes strong enough, frequent enough, and socially embedded enough that culture begins behaving like a second inheritance system. And that phrase matters. Second inheritance system. Genes pass from parent to child through bodies. Culture passes through teaching, imitation, correction, ritual, gesture, language, and memory. Genes wait for birth. Culture can travel tonight. Honestly, I think that is the whole mystery in one line. Culture can travel tonight. If the weather changes, genes may need generations. A story about the weather can move across camp before sleep. If a new prey animal behaves strangely, genes cannot respond before dawn. A new hunting instruction can, if a plant becomes valuable, only after boiling, pounding, soaking, or roasting. A body may never need to evolve special digestive hardware if the processing method is taught clearly enough. This is why the source says humans learned how to evolve without evolving physically. It is a provocative way to put it, and technically one must be careful. Humans do still evolve. The source knows that. Local adaptations continue. Selection never vanishes, but the phrase works because it captures the scale of the shift. The body stops being the first place where adaptation must happen. Adaptation begins happening in learned systems outside the body. Fire, clothing, tools, symbols, cooperation, story, rule, memory. Once that happens, the old tempo of natural selection is in trouble. Take cold as an example. Earlier, animals facing colder conditions may need thickened fur, altered metabolism, or changing body proportions over very long spans. Humans answer cold with fur taken from something else, with fire held against darkness, with shelter improved one seam at a time, with sleeping arrangements, with shared body warmth, with remembering which valley blocks the wind and which kills the careless. That is adaptation. Absolutely. But it is adaptation through knowledge, not through immediate anatomical redesign. Or take prey. A human body is not especially impressive in isolation. We have no claws worth mentioning, miserable natural armor, and a sprint that would embarrass many animals if judged cruelly. Yet, a sharpened point, a coordinated group, a shouted signal, a plan made before the hunt, a memory of migration route, and suddenly the body does not need to become a better predator on its own. It has externalized the missing anatomy into technique. The source delights in this, and so do I, because it is both humble and astonishing. Human beings did not become physically supreme. They became creatively compensatory. A slightly ridiculous-looking ape with a stable body plan learned how to wrap intelligence around its weaknesses until the weaknesses stopped deciding the outcome. And language sits at the center of it all. The source does not reduce the cognitive revolution to language alone, but language is the invisible engine under nearly every part of the argument. Precise sounds attached to remembered actions, shared categories, invisible things named as though they were present, plans spoken before execution, warnings about dangers not currently visible, stories about the dead, stories about places not here, rules applying tomorrow, imagination made social. You know that feeling when you can explain a small trick to someone and save them an hour of frustration. Now magnify that across millennia. That is language working as evolutionary force. With language, a mistake does not have to die with the one who made it. With language, a discovery does not have to remain private. With language, experience becomes transferable wealth. The source also draws on the archaeological signs of symbolic life because symbols change the scale of culture yet again. Beads, pigments, engravings, arranged objects, perhaps body marking, perhaps group markers. perhaps ritual meaning. It is debated in details. Certainly, archaeology always lives partly inside interpretation. But the broad point stands. Humans begin treating objects as carriers of meaning beyond direct use. Once that happens, culture becomes sticky. Group identity becomes teachable. Alliances become markable. Memory becomes material. A shell bead is small, but a shell bead with shared meaning is no longer just a shell. A stripe of ochre across skin is only color until a group agrees that it marks kin. Grief, readiness, beauty, status, belonging, or warning. Then color becomes social technology. Then matter itself begins carrying instructions. This is where the story becomes almost beautiful enough to hide its darkness, because what the source is really describing is a species that nearly died, came through narrow and fragile, and then discovered that symbols and teaching could do the work that climate once forced directly onto bone. That is elegant. It is also unnerving. Once knowledge becomes cumulative, human power begins growing in a way the body no longer predicts. And that helps explain the freeze. Why did human evolution seem to stop? Because the body had become good enough, and the mind had become faster. Not perfect enough, not final. Good enough. The bottleneck survivors carried a viable modern frame into a world where culture was beginning to outcompete mutation as the main adaptive tool. Under those conditions, major anatomical change becomes less necessary. A problem that might once have killed the wrong-shaped body can now sometimes be solved by an invention, a habit, a teaching chain, or a social rule. The source builds gently from cognition toward the practical examples that will come next. And you can feel those examples gathering. Fire will matter more. Clothing will matter more. Cooking will matter more. Cooperation will matter more. Once culture can stack improvements across generations, every solved problem reduces the need for the body to redesign itself in response. This does not mean natural selection retires politely. It still acts. People still die. Environments still punish. Traits still matter. But the contest changes. Genes are no longer the only archive of successful adaptation. Human groups now carry a second archive in memory and behavior, and that archive updates much faster. Picture a long winter edge camp. A child wrapped in stitched hide. A banked hearth glowing under ash so it survives until morning. Tools hung carefully where they can be found in the dark. A story being told about where the herd turned last season. A warning about thin ice. A joke. Even because humor is one more way tension becomes bearable and memory stays lively. All of that is adaptation. None of it requires a new skeleton. I think that is why this phase of the story feels so profound. It is not only about intelligence increasing, it is about intelligence becoming shareable in a durable way. Private cleverness can die. Shared cleverness accumulates. And once it accumulates, humanity begins stepping into environments and solving pressures that would have demanded bodily transformation in almost any other species. So sit with that by the fire for another moment. The same hands from the mirror. The same skull from the bottleneck. The same basic body. but now carrying pigment, tool memory, fire memory, hunting plans, names, signals, kinship rules, warnings, songs, stories, and techniques that can move faster than offspring can grow. This is the new inheritance. And once it is in motion, the old rule begins to bend. Bodies still matter. Minds now matter differently. Culture has taken hold. And maybe that is the deepest shift of all. Earlier, evolution changed the creature so it could meet the world. Human culture began changing the meeting itself. The wind stayed cold, but clothing changed the encounter. The prey stayed fast, but planning changed the encounter. Darkness stayed dangerous, but hearths changed the encounter. The body remained astonishingly familiar, while the conditions of survival were rewritten outside the body by memory and cooperation. That is why the next step in the story does not need a new kind of human. It only needs the old human learning how to build a newer world around the same ancient bones. The next movement will make the argument even clearer by leaving symbols behind for a while and turning to raw survival. Cold wind, fire warmth, hides, cooking, weapons, food processing, the practical cheat codes that let one unchanged human body survive 1,000 different worlds without having to become 1,000 different animals to do it. By the time culture has fully entered the story, the body begins losing its old job. Not completely. Of course. The body still matters. Hunger still hurts. Cold still bites. Teeth still ache. Muscles still tire. A twisted ankle on bad ground is still a serious event, and an empty stomach remains a very persuasive philosopher. But the source wants us to notice something profound. For most of the history of life, survival problems demanded physical answers. A colder world required a different body. A different prey required a different body. A harsher landscape required a different body. Human beings gradually became something stranger. We started answering physical problems with learned systems outside the body. That is such a beautiful and unnerving shift. It means that when the world changed, our skeleton did not have to race after it anymore. Our knowledge did. Let us begin with cold, because cold is one of the simplest tyrants to understand. It does not argue. It does not flatter. It takes warmth from skin, and then from muscle, then from judgment, then from life. In earlier ages of evolution, repeated cold over immense spans can favor thicker fur, broader trunks, different limb proportions, altered metabolism, all the slow bodily answers natural selection knows how to write. But the source places human beings in a different relationship to winter. We do not wait for fur. We skin something that already has fur. We do not wait for denser insulation beneath our skin. We scrape hides, soften them, stitch them, wrap them, and teach the wrapping. If you slow that down, it becomes almost hypnotic. A hide stretched between hands. Stone scrapers moving again and again over the inner surface. The smell of animal fat, smoke, and wet leather. Bone needles, sinew thread. Fingers numbed by cold and then warmed again near banked coals. One small stitch, then another. then another, a child watching, an elder correcting the angle gently, a garment becoming a kind of external evolution, made not by gene frequency, but by patience. I have always liked that comparison, even though it sounds a little mischievous. Clothing is portable fur made by memory. It does what evolution once had to do, but it does it tonight instead of over 10,000 winters. The source moves from there to fire, and it is hard to overstate how important that move is. Fire is not only warmth. Fire is time rearranged. Fire is darkness pushed back. Fire is protection, cooking, signal, social gravity, and the oldest technology of environmental defiance. A body without thick fur can sleep through a colder night if it sleeps near flame. A camp with fire can occupy a place that would otherwise punish it out. A group that can keep embers alive through bad weather no longer belongs entirely to the terms the climate tries to impose. Picture a hearth after the loud part of evening has ended, not the roaring heroic fire from paintings. A lower, steadier one, red light under ash, the smell of old wood and a little smoke woven into hide and hair. Someone nudges a blackened branch inward. Someone else cups hands near the heat. Children curl under coverings. An older person watches the embers the way a banker might watch a treasury, because that is what they are. Stored survival. The difference between a body freezing and a body enduring. And once fire is controlled, food changes too. The source becomes especially persuasive here, because food is where cultural adaptation looks least glamorous and most decisive. A body can only digest what it can digest. That seems obvious. But cooking rewrites the bargain. Tubers too tough become edible. Meat too risky becomes safer. Seeds too difficult become manageable. Bitter things lose some of their bitterness. Nutrients become easier to extract. Energy arrives more efficiently. In a very real sense, cooking is outsourced digestion. It lets one body do more with the same teeth, the same gut, the same hands. That means the body does not need immediate, dramatic redesign to exploit new environments. People can pound grain, roast roots, boil troublesome foods, dry meat, store marrow, smoke fish, and pass along the sequence exactly enough that the next household does not have to rediscover the trick from hunger. Again, the pattern repeats. Biology could have adapted slowly. Culture adapts now. Honestly, that word now is the whole story. Now is what genes cannot compete with. A useful mutation must wait for inheritance. A useful method can move by voice before dawn. So the source gives us humanity as a species that starts solving one survival pressure after another by external means. Cold with hides and hearths. Hunger with processing and preservation. Fast prey with better weapons. Distance with cooperation. Darkness with controlled flame. Risk with memory. Uncertainty with shared rule. The body remains the ancient bottleneck body, but the world around it is gradually filled with aids, tools, and habits that make the same body capable of far more than it should manage on its own. Take hunting. A human being alone on open ground is a rather hopeful creature. Not nothing, certainly, We are stubborn. We can throw. We can track. We can last. But the source does not romanticize naked anatomy here. It emphasizes strategy. A sharpened point extends the arm. The throwing technique extends force. Coordinated movement extends the body into a group intelligence. Language extends timing. A trap extends patience. A remembered migration route extends vision into the future. Once all that is active, the prey is no longer facing one primate body. It is facing a network. This is why the source keeps returning to teaching. Techniques do not merely exist. They survive by being transmitted with enough fidelity to remain useful and enough flexibility to improve. That is the true cultural cheat code. Not invention alone. Invention can die with the inventor. Cumulative teaching is the miracle. Someone learns a better way to have to point. Someone else remembers it. Someone improves the binding. Someone else finds a stone source more suitable. A generation later, the tool is better than before, and no bone in the maker's hand needed to change for that improvement to happen. There is something wonderfully humbling in that. Human dominance does not begin with bodily perfection. It begins with awkward creatures that keep notes in each other. The source also points out that cultural adaptation has a strange side effect. It protects people who would otherwise be filtered out by harsher selection. A weaker hunter may still matter if he makes better tools. An injured elder may still matter if she remembers roots, seasons, treatments, stories, kin ties, and danger signs. A person with limited physical strength may still contribute through childcare, gathering, repair, planning, ritual memory, or conflict mediation. This broadens survival. It makes the group more than the sum of its most immediately athletic bodies. You know that feeling when someone in a household is not the strongest or fastest, yet somehow the whole house functions because they remember everything, notice everything, and quietly keep the chaos from becoming real. Human evolution begins making room for that kind of value in a deeper way once culture becomes central. And this matters because natural selection is brutally literal when culture is weak. If only the fast survive, then speed dominates. If only the strong survive, then strength dominates. But if a group can preserve and protect individuals whose value lies in memory, cooperation, teaching, planning, or technical skill, then the old ruthless filters begin to soften. That does not end selection. It changes the terrain on which it acts. The source treats this as one of the main reasons major visible evolution slows down. A species buffered by tools, fire, food processing, and cooperative care simply does not need the body to carry every adaptive burden directly anymore. Think of shelter too. A body designed for one climate can enter another if walls intervene. Hide, branch, reed, mud, snow, stone, whatever the local answer may be. Shelter is another external organ. It turns exposed skin into something conditionally protected. The wind still exists. Rain still exists. Night cold still exists. But they no longer reach the body in the same unmediated way. The environment is still there. The encounter has changed. That phrase matters. The encounter has changed. The source keeps circling this without saying it quite that way, but that is really the core. Human beings did not make the world stop being difficult. We changed how difficulty reached us. Culture inserted itself between body and pressure. Not perfectly. Never perfectly. But enough to matter more and more. And because culture can improve quickly, the buffering effect compounds. One innovation joins another. Fire joins clothing. Clothing joins shelter. Shelter joins storage. Storage joins planning. Planning joins division of tasks. Division of tasks joins more efficient childcare. Better childcare preserves more knowledge carriers. More knowledge carriers improve the next cycle of innovation. A feedback loop forms. The same ancient body now lives inside a cocoon of learned adaptation. I have always found that image deeply strange. A cocoon of knowledge. Not soft. Not safe in the modern sense. Prehistoric life remained hard, often brutally so, but hard in a different way than it would have been without culture. Hard while carrying advantages that bodies alone could never have grown fast enough to provide. There is a slightly humorous side to this too, and I think it helps make the point feel human rather than mechanical. Evolution may have looked at us and expected to solve cold by adding better insulation. We solved it by stealing insulation from mammoths, deer, bison, and whatever else had the kindness to evolve it first. Nature prepared the fur. Humanity borrowed it with terrible manners and excellent timing. The same pattern appears again with food. Rather than evolving giant new digestive miracles, we smash, grind, soak, roast, wear, and cook. We bully the environment into easier forms. We let fire do chemistry for us. We let stone do dentistry for us. We let containers do stomach work ahead of time. It is wonderfully unfair in evolutionary terms. And that unfairness is precisely why the body stops changing so dramatically. The species has discovered that intelligence plus cooperation can often outrun mutation plus time. The source uses these examples to prepare the next major shift. Because once culture is doing this much work in mobile bands, the later transition into agriculture and settlement becomes even more consequential. A little buffering becomes a great deal of buffering. Firelight becomes ovens. Hide shelters become walls. Seasonal planning becomes stored grain. Occasional care becomes institutional care. The body is not only helped now and then, it begins living inside systems designed to reduce environmental cruelty. That is where natural selection grows softer still. So stay for a little longer in this older world of practical adaptation. Feel the cold outside the shelter and the stored warmth inside it. Smell wet, hide drying near smoke. Hear marrow bones crack under careful blows. Hear grinding stones turn stubborn seeds into edible possibility. Hear the murmur of instruction traveling from older mouth to younger ear. See the unchanged human hand doing changed work. This is the great quiet turning point. The body remains familiar. The solutions do not. A species that nearly vanished now begins surviving not by waiting for better bones, but by building better answers around the bones it already has. The next movement of the story will widen from this small band-level ingenuity into the deeper softening of selection that comes with settled life. Agriculture, stored food, care for the vulnerable, and a world in which more and more people survive who once would not have made it through the old filters at all. Once the species has learned how to answer the world with culture, the next great change is not a new body. It is a new environment made by the same old body. That is what agriculture and settlement really are in the source's telling. Not only food production, not only villages, not only fields and walls and storage jars, they are a giant layer of insulation between human biology and the old raw pressures that once shaped it so harshly. A species that was already buffering itself with fire, clothing, tools, memory, and cooperation now begins buffering itself with permanent systems. The emotional atmosphere changes immediately. The mobile band lives by movement, acute attention, and seasonal uncertainty. The settled village lives by repetition, accumulated labor, and stored hope. Dawn over a field feels different from dawn over a temporary camp. Grain heads moving in weak wind. Mud walls holding last night's warmth. Oven heat waking before sunrise. The smell of straw, animal, dung, and crushed seed. Paths worn by the same feet again and again. Children growing in places their grandparents already know. Survival becomes less improvisational in one sense and more infrastructural in another. The source treats this as one of the biggest reasons human evolution appears to freeze in major physical terms. Once food can be stored, once a winter can be met, partly with last season's labor, once a settlement can protect bodies from weather and wandering danger, the old brutal filters of selection no longer cut with the same clean force. That does not mean settled life is easy. Far from it. Agriculture brings disease, crowding, hierarchy, hard labor, failed harvests, and the tedious forms of anxiety that emerge whenever people build a future they cannot carry away on their backs. The source knows this. It is not selling a pretty village fantasy, but it insists, correctly I think, that even flawed settlement changes the math of survival. More people live. More kinds of people live. More children live. More injuries are survived. More weaknesses become tolerable if the surrounding system can compensate. That last point is especially important. In a harsh mobile environment, every serious weakness is negotiated directly with weather, distance, predators, and hunger. In a village, weakness can be shared across a group. A strong field worker may feed an elder whose knees are gone. An elder may repay the debt with memory, childcare, tool repair, dispute settlement, seed knowledge, medicinal knowledge, ritual knowledge, or simply the steadying effect of wisdom in a world that always needs more of it. The source returns again and again to this widening of survivable human variation, and it should. It may be one of the deepest reasons large visible evolution slows. The group begins protecting more kinds of bodies than the environment alone would have spared. I have always found healed bones among ancient humans extraordinarily moving for this reason. A femur once broken and later knitted. A skull injury survived. Teeth lost, yet the person lived on. The source draws on exactly this mood. Skeletons do not speak, but sometimes They reveal that a person who should have died under pure individual struggle instead continued. Someone fed them, sheltered them, waited for them. Human beings became the sort of species that carries its less efficient members farther than natural selection would prefer. That is not weakness. It is a redefinition of fitness through culture. And once that redefinition takes hold, the old selective filters lose some of their ruthlessness. A person does not have to be the fastest if food is stored. A child does not have to withstand every stress alone if a settlement absorbs some of it. An injury does not have to end a life immediately if other hands can cover the work for a season. Pregnancy and infancy, those old dangerous thresholds, also shift under these new conditions. Settled life is not uniformly kinder, but it is differently organized. Different organization changes who survives long enough to reproduce. The source builds on this with division of labor. This is where human social life becomes an evolutionary cushion. Not everyone has to do the same task equally well. One person grinds grain. Another watches children. Another repairs tools. Another carries water. Another remembers the cycles of planting. Another manages animals. Another treats wounds with learned plants and procedures. Another negotiates with neighbors. The result is that the group can preserve far more kinds of usefulness than a purely immediate survival world would reward. You know that feeling when a household works not because everyone is equally good at the same thing, but because everyone is differently necessary. Agriculture makes that principle larger than the household. Villages turn it into system. System changes selection. The source also moves naturally from this into care. Care is not sentimental in this framework. It is evolutionary consequence. Once a group can support children better, can keep elders alive longer, can help the sick through dangerous stretches, can allow pregnant women and new mothers greater continuity, the mortality pattern shifts. Infant survival improves. Maternal survival can improve. People with small disadvantages are no longer removed so quickly. This does not make the world safe. Ancient life remains dangerous, and many people still die terribly young. But the filter grows softer. Softer is enough to matter across millennia. And then, medicine, or at least early medicine in the broad human sense, begins entering the picture. The source uses this carefully. Not modern hospitals, of course. More like increasing human competence at wound treatment, herbal knowledge, bone setting, fever care, sanitation habits, and all the small practical acts by which suffering is made more survivable. A cleaned wound is an evolutionary event if it preserves a life that would otherwise have ended. A midwife who knows one more trick to protect mother and child is an evolutionary event. A community that learns where waste should not go is an evolutionary event. It is all selection pressure being redirected through intelligence and care. This is why the source describes culture as having overtaken biology rather than erased it. The genes still exist. The body still matters. But the world now reaches the body through layers of mediation. Grain stores, walls, routines, customs, knowledge, sanitation, medicine, cooperation. Every layer softens the direct sculpting hand of the environment. That is also where the story becomes faintly sad. Because the same old human body that once stood under ash-darkened skies now begins living in places where hunger may still come, but not from the same immediate ferocity. Predators matter less. Exposure matters less. Seasonal luck matters less, at least in the short term. The body has not become stronger than before. It has become more protected than before. Protection is a wonderful thing. Protection also changes the old rules. Honestly, this may be one of the most important insights in the entire source. Evolution does not need to stop in order to appear frozen. It only needs to lose its former intensity at the level of large visible body change. And that is exactly what cultural buffering accomplishes. Once more people survive across more conditions with more support, the pressure for dramatic anatomical redesign weakens. The source wants the listener to feel this not as abstract principle only, but as a lived change in atmosphere. So let us slow it down. A village in early light. Stored grain in a clay bin, dry and patient. Smoke rising from an oven before the air has warmed. A child with a slight limp, still laughing near a doorway because the day does not demand a sprint across dangerous ground. An elder with clouded eyes sorting seed by touch. A woman recovering from birth, while other hands take up the morning tasks. A broken tool replaced from storage instead of forcing a whole band into crisis. A bad week survived because last season still exists inside jars and woven baskets. All of that is selection pressure, altered by culture. And then there is one more important turn. Once settlements become larger and denser, they also create new problems that the old body is not perfectly built for. Disease spreads faster. Sanitation becomes harder. Stress changes form. Labor may narrow into repetitive strain rather than general mobility. The source hints at this because it wants to avoid a naive progress story. Humans did not enter villages and become biologically comfortable. They entered another kind of mismatch. Yet even that mismatch often still reduces the old direct filter that would have otherwise removed many individuals quickly from the reproductive future. That is why the body can remain mostly stable while the lived human condition keeps mutating. Stability does not mean perfection. It means the environment is no longer forcing new visible design at the pace it once did. The source is also preparing us here for the fossil record, because fossils and skeletons will later provide the visual support for this claim. Earlier human evolution shows stronger structural shifts over long spans. Later, modern humans remain, on the whole, recognizably the same creature. There are regional differences. There are local adaptations. There are subtle changes, but the big, visible rewrite does not come. Agriculture, care, division of labor, and medicine help explain why. There is a slightly wicked joke hidden in all this, and I think it is worth smiling at softly. Evolution spent millions of years building a body for raw survival. Then humanity started building villages that allowed all sorts of troublesome, is brilliant, fragile, irritable, poetic, anxious, injured, stubborn people to survive long enough to pass themselves on. No efficient natural system would design us this tenderly. Culture did. That tenderness is expensive. Yes. It leads to complexity, dependency, inequality, new suffering, new disease. But it also preserves wider human possibility and preservation. in evolutionary terms, is everything. And perhaps that is the quietest tragedy in the whole process. The ancient body that once had to bargain directly with weather, distance, and hunger begins living inside systems so elaborate that many pressures become indirect. A failed harvest can be met from storage, until storage fails. An illness can be treated, until treatment fails. A weak child can be protected, until the wider system breaks. Human life becomes less exposed and more entangled. That entanglement is exactly what preserves more bodies, more personalities, more lineages, and more variation in the everyday sense, even while it slows the brutal clarity of old selection. The source does not romanticize this safety. It simply notices that once survival is distributed across walls, the stores, neighbors, customs, and care, the body is no longer standing alone before the world. So stay a little longer in this early settled world. Hear grain pouring into storage. Hear a mortar and pestle striking slowly. Hear the low voices of people who expect to meet again at the same place tomorrow. Feel the difference between sleeping in a temporary camp and sleeping inside walls that remember you. Feel how the same old body now wakes inside a human-made environment that bends pressure before it reaches the skin. This is the long softening. The old harsh selection does not vanish. It loosens. That loosening is why visible human evolution seems to stall. And once it has loosened enough, the skeleton itself begins to tell the story. The next movement will turn toward bones, skulls, and the strange stillness of our own form. A species outwardly almost frozen, inwardly transformed by knowledge, care, and the learned structures that made survival possible without demanding a new body in return. By the time we reach the bones, the argument becomes almost uncomfortably simple. If human evolution, in the big visible sense, really slowed after the bottleneck, and after culture began carrying more of the adaptive burden, then the skeleton should show it. It should show earlier turbulence, then later steadiness, earlier dramatic change, then long familiarity. And that is very close to the picture the source wants to leave in the listener's mind. The fossil record is never a complete library. It is more like a damaged archive after flood and fire. Shelves missing, labels fallen away, whole rooms lost, a few stubborn documents surviving where thousands did not. Still, enough remains to trace the broad outline. Earlier, human evolution is busy. Bodies change in proportion. Robustness, cranial shape, facial projection, limb use, brain volume, posture, and movement strategy across deep time. Species rise, overlap, spread, narrow, vanish. The old human story before us is not one long, calm line. It is crowded, experimental, uneven. The body is still doing much of the work. Then something settles. Not into perfection, not into stillness absolute enough to impress a machine, into a slower kind of sameness. Anatomically modern humans appear, and once they are established, the later record begins feeling oddly familiar. The source lingers over that familiarity because it is not merely a scientific observation. It is a mood, Skull after skull under museum light, and the feeling grows harder to ignore. These are us. Not exactly every individual detail, not every local proportion, but unmistakably us. I have always found museum halls full of human bones, stranger than halls full of anything else. Spears, crowns, pottery, statues, those all feel like history. Bones do not. Bones feel like recognition. A forehead curve, a jawline, the orbit of an eye, the slope where nose meets face, the cage of the ribs, the tilt of the pelvis, the long shafts of the legs built for distance and balance. You do not look at them and think ancient object. You look at them and think missing person on a scale too large to bear. The source uses that emotional familiarity well. It reminds the listener that if you placed a skeleton from many tens of thousands of years ago beside a modern skeleton, a trained observer would find differences. Yes, but the differences would be variations within a recognizable human frame, not evidence of a whole new kind of body, arriving every few thousand years, the way earlier phases of human evolution sometimes suggest. The dramatic redesign has slowed. That is what anatomical stasis means here. Not zero change. Not frozen in ember. More like a species that has stopped rewriting its blueprint every time the weather turns ugly. The core hardware is stable enough now that culture can handle more of the environmental negotiation. The source also makes the comparison by implication. Earlier humans, older members of the long family line, carry more obvious structural divergence. Different cranial proportions, different degrees of robustness, different relationships between face and skull, different bodies for different demands. By the time modern humans spread widely, the argument goes, that kind of visible rewriting largely gives way to variation inside a much tighter template. Let us slow down in that museum again. A row of casts, perhaps, or real fossils in careful cases. Cool air, soft labels, a child whispering somewhere farther down the hall, a skull from an earlier human species with features that feel more distant from the face, you know. Then another, then later specimens. The distance narrows, the familiarity deepens. By the time you reach the humans of the last 70,000 years, the sensation is not of a primitive stranger anymore. It is of the same creature wearing old weather. That phrase matters to me. The same creature wearing old weather. Because that is really what the source is saying. The human body did not stop collecting local differences. It stopped changing its fundamental design as though every new climate needed a new species answer. This is where the source carefully allows for exceptions. That honesty is important. Humans did not become entirely static. Lactose tolerance evolves in some populations. High-altitude adaptations appear in Tibetans, Andean peoples, and others through different genetic pathways. Disease resistance shifts under agricultural and epidemic pressures. Skin color changes with latitude, sunlight, and vitamin balance. Hair texture, facial, soft tissue variation, metabolic traits, all of these continue to move at local scales. The source is not denying any of that. It is ranking it. And that ranking is the heart of the claim. These are modifications. Important ones. sometimes life-preserving ones, but not total rewrites of the operating system. They do not turn the human body into a new general design the way earlier evolutionary transitions once did. They are adjustments to the same basic instrument. Honestly, that is why the word freeze in the title works, even though it is technically a little dramatic. Human evolution did not literally freeze. It simply stopped behaving like the old engine of spectacular anatomical innovation. A better phrase might be that the body entered a long plateau while culture climbed a mountain. But titles have to get people through the door. The source knows that. The deeper content is more precise. Take lactose tolerance as an example. In a pre-agricultural world, the ability to digest milk sugar into adulthood is mostly irrelevant. In herding societies, it becomes useful. Selection favors it in certain regions. That is evolution, real and measurable. Yet a milk-digesting adult remains unmistakably the same kind of human in every broad structural way. The skeleton does not reinvent itself because the gut got a local software update. The same with altitude. Thin air is a brutal teacher. Some human groups living high for long periods evolve remarkable ways of handling oxygen stress. Different populations solve the problem differently, which is fascinating in itself. But again, we are looking at specialized tuning inside one body plan, not a radical new body departing from the ancient frame. The source uses these examples almost like polite objections it welcomes into the room, only to show that they do not overthrow the larger thesis. And there is something slightly funny in that. In a dark, scholarly way, human evolution kept editing footnotes, while culture rewrote the main text. The fossil record supports that feeling. A long run of recognizable modern anatomy. Variations, yes. Regional differences, yes, but the same species frame carrying tools, symbols, clothes, myths, agriculture, cities, medicine, screens, satellites, and sleeplessness, all without ever deciding that perhaps a bigger stomach for processed sugar or a different spine for office chairs might have been useful. Evolution, it seems, did not get the memo about civilization's later plans. The source draws attention to the strange asymmetry here. Bodies change slowly. Culture changes fast. Culture then changes the environment faster still. The result is that human beings now live in worlds wildly unlike the worlds that shaped their instincts and physiology. This is where the story begins turning toward mismatch. And mismatch is one of those ideas that can sound obvious until it begins explaining too much. We crave calorie-dense food because scarcity once haunted us. Now abundance haunts us instead. We stay alert to social threat because small group reputation once mattered intensely. Now we carry that same alertness into enormous anonymous systems. Offices, feeds, networks, cities, where the nervous system can no longer easily tell what deserves panic and what deserves a shrug. We prefer rest after effort because rest once saved energy. Now, rest is available in ways the ancient body was never built to regulate. But before we fully step into mismatch, the source wants the listener to remain one moment longer with the bones. Because the bones are the quiet proof that something changed in the way change itself was happening. Earlier, evolution rewrote anatomy more boldly. Later, humanity mostly keeps the same machine, and keeps changing the world around it instead. That is a very odd triumph. We became the species that moved the burden of adaptation outward, into clothes, into shelter, into tools, into stories, into law, into food systems, into medicine, into social support, into everything the body can borrow from mind and group, so it does not have to become a whole new animal each time conditions shift. You know that feeling when a house is renovated again and again around one old supporting frame? New wiring, new windows, new plumbing, new furniture, new paint. Different generations passing through, yet the same deep beams holding it all up. That is the human body over the last 70,000 years. The renovations are endless. The frame is stubborn. The source uses this stubbornness not as disappointment, but as revelation. Human beings did not fail to evolve. They changed the rules of what counted as successful adaptation. The fossil record, therefore, becomes strangely peaceful by the standards of earlier human history. Not empty, not static in every detail, peaceful in the sense that the same form keeps returning, the same kind of skull, the same gait, the same hands, the same chest built for breath and speech, the same pelvis carrying difficult births and long dependency, the same long childhood that makes teaching worth the trouble. That long childhood is worth a pause, too, because it may be one of the deepest signs that culture has taken over. Human children remain helpless for an absurdly long time compared with many animals. That is expensive, dangerous, inconvenient. It is also perfect for a species that survives through learning. We are born unfinished because instruction has become part of our design. The stable body does not arrive complete. It arrives teachable, and teachability may be the most important fossil of all, even though bones cannot preserve it directly. So stand once more under the museum light. Look at the old skull and feel recognition. Look at the modern skull and feel almost no shock. Notice how the years between them are filled not with a new species body, but with new forms of life wrapped around the same form. Notice how the story of humanity becomes less a story of what the skeleton became and more a story of what the skeleton learned to carry. That is where the source now turns fully toward the present. Because once you accept that the body stayed mostly familiar while culture accelerated, you must face the next uncomfortable truth. We are still living inside that old body. The bottleneck body, the firelight body, the hunter-gatherer nervous system. The same ancient frame now dropped into supermarkets. Notifications, office buildings, traffic noise, processed sugar, chronic stress, artificial light, and all the strange, permanent weather of modern life. That is not a separate story. It is the final consequence of everything we have followed so far. If the body remained largely the same while culture kept changing the world faster and faster, then the final part of the story is not ancient at all. It is us. That is why the source ends where it does. Not in a cave, not in a volcanic sky, not in a museum corridor full of skulls, but in the modern mismatch between an old biological creature and a very new environment. Once you see the body as a bottleneck survivor, as a stable ancient machine that culture began surrounding with ever more elaborate solutions. Modern life starts looking less like destiny and more like a wildly accelerated experiment performed on inherited hardware. The phrase evolutionary mismatch can sound neat, almost too neat, as if it belongs on a tidy chart in a lecture hall. But when you live inside it, it feels much messier. It feels like craving sweetness when sweetness has become industrial. It feels like a stress response built for immediate danger, spending its days reacting to deadlines, traffic, debt, public comparison, unread messages, and the low electric pressure of being reachable all the time. It feels like a social brain built for small groups trying to interpret thousands of faces, opinions, and judgments, many of them not even physically present. The source handles this carefully because it would be easy to turn the ending into complaint. It does not do that. It simply says, the same old body that survived scarcity now lives amid excess. And the same old nervous system that once helped us survive uncertainty now often drowns in a form of uncertainty it was never built to process. I have always found that insight less depressing than clarifying, because once you understand that your hunger, your fear, your distraction, your restlessness, your love of easy calories, your difficulty with delayed gratification, your sensitivity to status, your tendency to scan for threat, all these things are not personal moral failures first, but ancient adaptive tendencies operating in a new setting. The whole drama softens slightly. The body is not broken. It is old. The world changed faster than the body did. Picture a human from 30,000 years ago carried somehow, gently, impossibly, into a modern supermarket. Light everywhere. Rows of color. Sugar concentrated beyond anything in wild landscapes. Salt, fat, starch, combinations no ancestral season would have delivered in such abundance. The ancient body would not call this danger. It would call it miracle. And that is exactly the problem. What once signaled rare opportunity now signals endless surplus. The old craving does not know the feast has no natural ending. The same is true of stress. A hunter-gatherer nervous system expects bursts. A rustle in the brush. A rival group nearby. A child missing. A storm turning ugly. A hunt about to fail. Immediate, embodied, actionable pressure. Then recovery. Modern stress is often different. Abstract. Delayed. Symbolic. Mortgage. Reputation. Career uncertainty. Health anxiety. The constant, small humiliation of comparing one's life to too many other lives. The body responds anyway, because the body does not care whether the tiger is made of teeth or email. Pressure is pressure. Cortisol does not read context the way philosophy does. And then there is social life. The source points out that human beings were shaped in intimate groups where everyone knew who had shared food, who had lied, who had skill, who had failed, who was grieving, who was in danger, who mattered. Modern social life can be vast, fragmented, performative, and oddly disembodied. Yet the same ancient brain keeps trying to treat every signal of exclusion or judgment as though tribe and survival may be on the line. It is no wonder we become tired. We are trying to run Stone Age emotional circuitry inside digital weather. That phrase is worth lingering over. Digital weather. Notifications falling like artificial rain. Opinions blowing through the room from people not physically present. Bright screens at midnight telling the brain that day has not ended. The old body keeps trying to interpret all of it with systems shaped by firelight, darkness, dawn, and face-to-face memory. The source uses mismatch not only to explain our problems, but to complete the larger argument about frozen evolution. We did not stop adapting. We shifted the site of adaptation outward. The outward world then kept moving so quickly that the body now often appears out of sync with the environment culture built for it. That is the price of winning through knowledge rather than anatomy. You keep the old machine. The machine keeps carrying older expectations. And still, the source does not end in despair. I think that is important. Because the same cultural power that outpaced biology in the first place is also what lets us understand the mismatch. We can study it, name it, design around it a little, soften it, correct for some of it, at least locally. Fire once softened cold, clothing softened exposure, cooking softened the limits of the gut, medicine softened mortality. Perhaps awareness can soften mismatch too. That is a gentle hope, and a realistic one. But before hope, the source wants one final return to the fossil stillness of the body itself. It reminds us that if you step back from all the noise of modern life, from cities and medicine and politics and advertising and industry and digital systems, the creature carrying all that remains, astonishingly ancient. The hand on the phone is the same kind of hand that shaped stone and hide. The eyes on the screen are the same kind that scanned dark grass for movement. The heart hammering during a job interview is the same kind that hammered at the sound of something large moving outside the fire circle. You are not living in a modern body. You are living in an old body inside a modern situation. That may be the most soothing sentence in the entire story, because it explains so much without insulting anyone. The cravings are old. The vigilance is old. The longing for belonging is old. The exhaustion under constant stimulation is old. The body is not failing to keep up because it is foolish. It is ancient, and ancient systems move differently. The source also returns, beautifully, I think, to the idea that we are bottleneck descendants. That matters here because the mirror from the opening can now return with new force. When you look at your face, you are not looking at the end product of a species that kept reinventing itself physically every time history changed. You are looking at a form preserved through narrowing, then carried forward by culture. The face in the mirror is the face of someone who came through the volcanic winter and the long chain of ancestry. Someone whose descendants survived by learning faster than genes could update. There is something quietly majestic about that. Not in a boastful way. In a fragile way. We are not impressive because we are biologically finished. We are impressive because we are biologically ancient and culturally restless. The same body that once huddled under hide near banked coals now flies through cloud, stores libraries and invisible code, performs surgery, writes symphonies, argues online, forgets to sleep, eats too much sugar, and still startles at the dark in ways it cannot fully explain. Honestly, that combination is almost funny If you step back far enough, a Pleistocene nervous system trying to behave professionally in a meeting under fluorescent lights, a hunter-gatherer appetite wandering through a convenience store, a social brain built for 30 to 150 known people trying to process the moods of thousands. The comedy does not erase the tragedy. It simply makes the species feel real. And that is why the source's final conclusion works. Human evolution did not stop. It changed lanes. Major visible anatomical change slowed because the bottleneck narrowed the species and because culture took over as the faster adaptive force. Since then, we have continued evolving in smaller local ways. Yes, but the big story has been written elsewhere. In knowledge, technology, ritual, agriculture, cities, medicine, and all the external systems that let one ancient body survive worlds it was never directly shaped to inhabit. So let us return one last time to the mirror. A dim room, a face in soft light, the faint shine on the eyes, the shape of the skull under skin, the hand lifting slightly to touch the glass, as if checking that the person there is really present. Now imagine, beside that reflection, another face, 70,000 years old. Then one older still. Then older. And the shock is not how strange they are. The shock is how near they remain. That is the answer the source leaves us with. Why did human evolution seem to freeze after Toba nearly wiped us out? Because the survivors came through with a body already close to ours. Because the bottleneck narrowed the species and reduced its biological range. Because intelligence, cooperation, memory, language, and teaching became more important than radical new anatomy. Because culture learned to solve tomorrow's problems before genes could. Because once that happened, the skeleton no longer had to keep reinventing itself at the old pace. Because the modern world was built by a stable ancient creature that found a faster way to adapt. And perhaps the most haunting part is this. The body that survived Toba is still here. In your breath, in your pulse, in your hunger, in your startled response, in the shape of your sleep, in the way you still calm around warmth, familiar voices, safe shelter, trusted company, and the promise of enough food. Civilization may be young and noisy, but the animal inside it is very old. And it still carries the memory of cold skies, narrow survival, and the long, patient miracle of making it through. So let the story settle now. Let the museum lights dim. Let the volcanic ash drift out of the mind. Let the skulls return to their quiet shelves. Let the old fire burn low again, and let the mirror hold one final image, not of a modern person separated from the past, but of a survivor so ancient that history itself has mostly been a costume draped over the same enduring frame. Good night.